Excuse me, your planet is burning. Excuse me, it's really on fire. It may not seem hot where you're standing, but believe me, the flame's getting higher. I really don't want to disturb you. I know that the party was fun, but I think if you'd like to get out alive, it's time to start cooling it down. 'Cause this fire is all of our making. This fire is fueled by our greed. This fire will end when we come back again to only consume what we need. Excuse me, I see you're not listening. I wonder if you really heard, or if you'd rather believe in some strange fantasy that says that the fire's not there. Can't you see that the ones who deny it are the ones who would have most to lose? It's their fear of losing their wealth and their power that makes them deny and confuse. And this fire is all of our making. This fire is fueled by our greed. This fire will end when we come back again to only consume what we need. Excuse me for minding your business, but if you love our kids, please be true to that love in your heart and make a new start on a lifestyle called keeping it cool. It won't hurt too much if you hurry and get all your buddies on board. There's no time to delay. Let me show you the way. It's time to start loving this world. And this fire is all of our making. This fire is fueled by our greed. This fire will end when we come back again to only consume what we need. Sing it with me one more time. This fire is all of our making. This fire is fueled by our greed. This fire will end when we come back again to only consume what we need. Thank you.
I'm going to talk about what I think are the major drivers of ecological collapse, and what we have to do to stop and reverse these trends, the practical sort of things we have to do, and then what sort of economic and social arrangements we would have to have in order to make the sorts of changes we need to do to save the humans, and kind of more or less in that order. Okay, the world's climate scientists tell us we're facing a planetary emergency, that if we don't cut fossil fuel consumption, emissions by 40% by 2020 and 90% by 2050, we'll cross critical tipping points beyond which global warming will accelerate beyond any human capacity to stop it, to contain it. Yet for all the climate summits, the promises of voluntary restraint and carbon trading and carbon taxes, the growth of CO2 emissions and atmospheric concentrations has not just been relentless, it's been accelerating. In the early 1960s, when they first started tracking this, CO2 emissions concentrations grew by about 0.7% per year. In recent decades, especially since China's industrialized, the growth rates tripled to 2.1 per year. Last year it jumped to 2.74 per year, and the biggest increase since scientists began monitoring emissions, so it's just taking off. Climate scientists have become apoplectic about this. New alarms are sounding with increasing frequency. In November 2012, the World Bank, radical organization we know, warned that we could be heading for a 4-degree warming by the 2060s, a 4-degree centigrade warming. Last year, the International Energy Agency warned that we could be headed for 6 degrees. And last week, the American Academy for the Advancement of Science, the most mainstream conservative scientific establishment in the country, the premier scientific organization warned that there's a risk of abrupt, unpredictable, potentially irreversible changes in the Earth's climate system with massively disrupting impacts. This is the advancements, this is the most mainstream organization in America. 4 degrees may not seem like very much, but make no mistake, such an increase will be catastrophic for our species and most other. Humans have never experienced a 4-degree rise in average temperatures, but our ancestors experienced a 4-degree cooler world, and that was during the Wisconsin ice age, when the world looked like this and there were 2 miles of ice where you're sitting right now on top of you. That was 26,000 to 13,000 years ago, and that's what it looked like. A 4-degree rise would look like that. So that's what the world would look like with a 4-degree warmer world. Granted, it'll take a long time to get there, but we don't want to, as scientists have said, we don't want to get started down that slippery slope. But we're moving along a little bit. That you can see is the summer retreat of the ice cap in 1979 versus 2012. Quite a big loss in a pretty short time. Last week, NASA Goddard Institute for Space Science in New York issued a report that warned that not just climate change, but global industrial civilization could collapse in coming decades. Okay, so you get the idea, one report after another. So the point is, for all the evidence, instead of cutting emissions, nearly every capitalist government on the planet is putting pedal to the metal to accelerate growth and increase greenhouse gas emissions and speed us toward ecological collapse. So why is it that we're marching to disaster, sleepwalking to extinction, as the British environmental activist and journalist George Monbiot put it? Why can't we slam on the brakes before we ride off the cliff? I'm going to argue here that the problem is rooted in the requirements of capitalist reproduction, that large corporations are destroying life on Earth, that they can't help themselves, that they're doing what they're supposed to do, they can't change very much, and that so long as we live under this system, we have little choice but to go along with this destruction, to keep on pouring on the gas instead of slamming on the brakes, and that the only alternative, impossible as this may seem right now, is to overthrow this global economic order and all of the governments of the 1% that prop it up, and replace them with a global economic democracy, a radical, bottom-up, eco-socialist civilization. I'm going to make my case. Oh, you like that? I'm going to make my case in the form of 6 theses. I'll try really not to take too long with this, and I'm going to skip a whole bunch here to move this along a little bit. The first thesis is that capitalism is overwhelmingly the main driver of planetary ecological collapse, not population and not just industrialization either, but capitalism. Well, why is that? How far did I skip here? Yeah, corporations aren't necessarily evil, but they can't help themselves. They're not responsible to society, they're just doing what they're supposed to do. They're responsible to their shareholders, so Enbridge can't help but destroy the boreal forests of Alberta to plunder the tar sands and cook the climate. That's what shareholders demand. China National Petroleum spent $15 billion to buy Calgary-based Nexen Inc. to join this pillage of the tar sands. In its race to emulate American-style consumerism, China's built the largest car market in the world. This is a country with almost no fuel, no oil. IKEA can't help but level the forests of Siberia and Malaysia to feed its Chinese mills building disposable furniture. Apple can't help it if the cost of extracting rare earth minerals from the Congo is is violence, rape, slavery, forced induction of child soldiers, pygmies, and other Congolese. Monsanto and DuPont and Syngenta and Bayer Crop Science have no choice but to wipe out bees and butterflies and small farmers, to extinguish crop diversity in their effort to secure the grip of the world's over the world's food supply, and drenching the planet with their Roundups and atrazines and so on. This is how corporations are wiping out life on Earth in the course of a routine day. I think you know this one. That's the tar sands, and this is the before and the after, and that's the pipeline sending it to America, where we need it there to power things like this, and there also are this. The world needs many more of these. About 18 million people around the world are floating around these things during average year, and that's going to double very soon. And then, of course, we need that, and of course we need that. That's the next really big thing. And the Chinese are doing this, so they can breathe air like this, in Beijing. And the production there to make, junk that we don't need and junk that they don't need either. And this is the pollution. The air pollution is, I could talk about China a lot. Air pollution could be, in principle, cleaned up, but it's very hard to clean up water pollution and soil. And this, what you see, this black streak there, is from a plant in Bengbu City, Anhui Province, and then there's more like that. Just these are a few slides of polluting rivers in China. All that is to make stuff like this, which of course ends up in the trash. And then, so the Chinese have convinced themselves that the government's convinced us that they need to have an automobile society. So now they have the biggest traffic jams in the world, like that, and some gone for weeks. And then this is downtown Beijing, and traffic jam, 6 ring roads. They could have learned that from Los Angeles, but Newton had done that. But they actually had a pretty good system before. And then, of course, the air is like that. So that is all for what? In Adam Smith's day, when the first factories and mills produced crude tools and glass bottles and rolls of cloth by the thousands, capitalist freedom to make whatever they wanted didn't much matter, because they were few and small and didn't have much impact on the planet, on the environment. But today, when huge corporations have the power to produce everything in the millions and billions and trash it all tomorrow and reproduce it all again the next day, when they loot and pollute the planet to do this, it matters. This scale of production and technology matters. So that's the first point. The second point is that the solutions to our ecological crisis are blindingly obvious, but we can't take the steps to prevent ecological collapse tomorrow, because if we do that, we'd be out of work today. That's the way the system works. So we all know what we have to do. We need to suppress greenhouse gas emissions. We need to stop over-consuming natural resources. We need to stop toxic pollution. Stop producing waste that can't be recycled by nature. Mostly, actually, what we have to do is kind of just stop what we're doing. We don't need any big technical transformations to get to an ecologically sustainable world. We just need to stop over-producing and over-consuming. But we can't do that in our system, because we're all dependent on an economic system which growth is continuous, so we can have the jobs. We need the jobs. James Hansen, the world's foremost climate scientist, said, we face a planetary emergency. He said to save the humans, we would have to, coal emissions would have to be phased out as rapidly as possible, or global disasters will be a certainty. Yes, coal, oil, gas, most of the fossil fuels must be left in the ground. That's the explicit message the science provides again and again and again. This is Hansen speaking before Congress, but he doesn't look like that much anymore. He mostly looks like this, because he quit NASA, where he was the chief scientist, because he's so freaked out about climate change that he spends his time now as a full-time activist and against climate change, against fossil fuels. So he spends his time getting arrested. And there's a few examples from the White House and whatnot. But the problem is, how can Athabasca or Enbridge or Nexen leave their oil in the soil and still be responsible to shareholders? Are Kinder Morgan and TransCanada going to quit building pipelines and commit economic suicide to save the humans? Well, to ask the question is to answer it. And yet, if we don't put Athabasca and TransCanada and ExxonMobil and many other such companies out of business, it's we humans who are going to commit suicide. In fact, the problem is actually worse than that, because it's not just the oil companies. They're only part of the problem. I'm going to just take you to a little chart. Oh, that's James Hansen's book. You should, if you haven't seen this, you definitely should read this book. It's a great book. It's from my grandchildren. Okay, this, maybe, I don't know if you can read this or not, but I'm going to give you, this is a table of the breakdown by sector of the production of carbon dioxide and other greenhouse gases. So you can see there, but I'll give you, you can see kind of the rough breakdown. This is, well, agriculture is 13% and land use, but I'll just give you the table. Oh, okay, I'll speak in the microphone. More, okay. Bring this back here. Okay. Sorry. I'll give you the table here. This is easier. You can see. Okay, so the table, you can see people. The, can I take this out here? Just, so it's easier. All right, so that's better. So the table, you can see, of the share of energy, most people, a lot of environmentalists conflate. They conflate energy production, electricity generation, and power plants with global warming. But this table shows a very interesting thing, which is that electricity generates globally only 17% of CO2 emissions, heating 5%, and industry produces 14.7%, transportation 14%, other fuel consumption 8%, and so on. Agriculture is another big one, almost 14%. Land use, that's mostly deforestation, 12%. Industrial processes, 4%, and so on. Well, those are the big ones. Okay, so the point is that from this chart, you know, a lot of environmentalists will argue that, well, okay, it's energy production, it's the main thing. If we could just go to solar power, renewables, and you know, get rid of those coal-fired power plants that produce most of the CO2 emissions in the electricity sector, generating sector, that would solve most of the global warming problem. But I try to show you with this chart that that's not the case. That solved part of it, but only actually comparatively small part of it. If we're going to cut emissions by 90% or even much less than that, we're going to cut them by 90%. We have to cut a lot of emissions across the entire industrial structure, not just energy generation, but industry, transportation, agriculture, and so on. So even if we replaced every fossil fuel power plant in the world tomorrow, close them all down and replace them all with renewable windmills and solar panels, this would reduce greenhouse gas emission by less than 20%. So we can't, we're not going to get there that way. There have been, of course, for the most part in society, the mainstream wants to promote pro-market measures to reduce greenhouse gas emission. Those are predominantly have been of two kinds: cap and trade and green taxes. And I'll tell you a little bit why these can't work, why these don't work. Cap and trade was a kind of elegant scheme. The idea was that the government would set a cap on emissions, and then producers like coal power fire plants and so forth would have to meet. Dirty power plants would have to buy basically permission to keep producing dirty power, and clean power plants could sell them. So they would be able to trade these things, and that would reduce the overall share of the overall level of emissions. But the problem is that putting a cap on emissions is not acceptable to business. No business will accept this. No government will accept this. So every treaty, every negotiation, from Copenhagen to Cancun to Doha, every time every year when there's an annual negotiation about this, they all collapse in rancor and disagreement, and no government will accept caps on warming. And so that's why the government's abandoned it. That's why Obama abandoned his 2008 promise to set a hard cap on CO2 emissions, and instead has done almost everything he can to increase emissions. In his infamous 2012 State of the Union message, he laid out his all of the above energy strategy, which he said we're opening up more than 75% of our potential oil resources. We're drilling everywhere. We quadrupled the number of operating rigs, and we've got enough oil and gas pipelines to encircle the earth, and then some. This is the environmental president. Okay, so that's why cap and trade won't work at the end of the day, because really governments and industries will not accept a cap. The other strategy has been carbon taxes. Well, carbon taxes won't work either because they don't impose a cap. And that's why they're actually acceptable to business. So you find that Rex Tillerson, CEO of ExxonMobil, and Paul Anderson, the CEO of Duke Energy, that's the largest electric utility in the US, support carbon taxes. Last week, BP announced that it wants to be taxed too. Well, why do these companies want to be subjected to carbon taxes? Well, the answer is that they're not fools. They know that carbon taxes are not going to put them out of business. They know ExxonMobil's report last year said that it expects carbon tax or no tax. They expect global demand for energy resources to grow by 35%, 65% in the developing world. And nearly all of that is going to be provided by fossil fuels. ExxonMobil is not looking to leave the oil in the soil as a favor to James Hansen or Bill McKibben or the humans. ExxonMobil is looking to burn it all as fast as possible and enrich its shareholders. So at the end of the day, the only way to cut emissions is to, obviously, just to cut emissions. But the only way to do that would be to impose an emergency contraction, shut down and drastically retrench not just fossil fuel production, fossil fuel power plants, but all the industries that depend on fossil fuels, auto companies, airplane manufacturers, and airlines, containers, shipping, cruise lines, construction, chemicals, pharmaceuticals, synthetic fabrics, agribusiness, lumber, and many others. There's just no other way to get to this. I've been one of the kind of few people who's argued for a major kind of contraction. But the only person I've seen who really argues this in the mainstream press is George Monbiot, the Guardian newspaper columnist and environmentalist, and he wrote a book called Heat, which is a very good book, but it has a chapter on aviation in which he tries to go through kind of chapter by chapter different ways that one could reduce emissions and fuel consumption and so forth, like insulating your houses and this, that, and the other. But with aviation, he says there's just really nothing you can do. There are no solar-powered airplanes on anybody's drawing board. Using biofuels is actually even worse for many reasons. And so he says that at the end of the day, really, the only thing you can do is just we have to face the fact that we have to ground a lot of airplanes, not just stop growing these industries, but ground them. I mean, I know this sounds like so completely crazy, but I grew up in the 1950s, and people were, my parents were used to jetting off to Cancun or whatnot for vacation. We went camping, and we had like a song. I mean, we had a pretty reasonable life. We were living in caves. We had a car and a small house in Seattle. It wasn't terrible. We don't have anything like people have today. I mean, just the level of gross consumption of the planet today. And of course, the fossil fuels, of course, that's the biggest thing, the biggest contributor to global warming. But we're consuming everything else too. We're consuming fish to forest, minerals, metals, oil, fresh water, just consuming like there's no tomorrow. It's a blowout sale here. 2/3 of the American economy is geared to producing consumer goods and services. And it's true. We all need food, clothing, housing, transportation, and so on. But But most of what corporations produce today is not for what people need. Most of it's just produced as this guy said back in the 1950s, for the needs of corporations to sell to people, not for the needs of people. So you have all these, from the ever more obscene and pointless vanities of ruling class consumption, especially in America, the Bentleys and Maseratis and resorts and estates and yachts and jets, and the endless waste stream of designed in obsolescence driven repetitive mass consumption, fashions, cars, furniture, consumer electronics, all the retail malls and junk mail sales industry and so on and so forth, not to mention the arms industry. We're just consuming the planet to death. And here are a couple books I'd recommend people look at. Michael Clare, The Race for What's Left, The Last of the World's Resources, mostly about energy, but not only, and The Devouring Dragon by Craig Simons about China. I would guess, this is pretty unscientific here, but I guess probably 3/4 of all the goods and services we produce just don't need to be produced at all, probably even more in China. Most of this is just a resource hogging, polluting waste. We could all live better without it, more fulfilling, happier lives with all this junk and all the work required to make it. Capitalism was supposed to promise a world of the future of leisure. Well, we never quite got that. Instead, we're all working 60 hours a week to produce stuff that people don't really need. And, as I say, my working class parents lived without half this stuff in the 40s and 50s, and they weren't living in caves. But while people at least are talking about cutting fossil fuel consumption, nowadays nobody's even talking at all about cutting consumption of all the other natural resources: the forest, lumber, sea life, minerals, chemicals, fresh water. It's just it's just a blowout sale. The mainstream, there's no discussion at all of conservation. Nobody's talking about building small cars or public transportation. Instead, they're producing gigantic gas hogs and so on, about extreme extraction, ever faster cycles of obsolescence, the relentless quest for the next big thing. You need iPhones, and then it's iPads, and then glass, and then smartwatches, and self-driving cars, and on and on and on. This is all just going to come to a screeching halt one way or the other. Either we just keep consuming the planet to death until we finally collapse, like those Easter Islanders and Mayans and other societies that Jared Diamond recounted in his book Collapse, or we slam on the brakes and shut down the engine of overproduction once and for all and build an economy for people instead of profit. Third point, they get faster out of this, so I'm not going to be so bad. For better or worse, we are well into what scientists call the Anthropocene, which is nature doesn't run the earth anymore, we do. Humans are now the main drivers of climate change, and our actions will determine whether we survive in the next century. So if we're finally just one people on one planet, we need to make conscious and collective decisions about how to run our global economy and how it affects the natural world. Since the rise of capitalism 300 years ago or so, the world has more or less come to be run on the basis of market anarchy, on Adam Smith maxim that every individual should just maximize their own interest and look out for number one, and the public interest, the common good, would somehow get taken care of by itself. Well, that hasn't worked out so well. The problems of planet management can't be solved by individual choices in the marketplace. They require conscious, rational planning, international cooperation, and collective democratic control of the economy, not market anarchy. We need to prioritize the needs of people, humanity, the environment, other species, and future generations. When scientists tell us that we need to keep CO2 emissions below 350 parts per million, or that we need to limit the dumping of toxics or restrict deforestation and so on, how else can this be done except by means of economic planning and rationing? No market can do this. This is the point. If the market system can't save us, then what choice is there but to socialize most of the means of production and plan it directly? I don't claim to have all the answers here, and couldn't, because this is a collective job for all of you and all of us, and for the whole world, and even people not born yet. So it's going to have to take a lot of collective work to do this. But I would suggest that a kind of minimal program to save the humans and some other species we would have to do the following few things here. We'd have to put the brakes on out of control growth. Let me get here to, I skipped my, oh, no. Yeah, there you go, okay, all right. So this is the minimal program to save the world here. Put the brakes on growth, retrench or shut down all kinds of resource hogging, wasteful, polluting industries. Secondly, move to affect global convergence and contraction and convergence on a per capita basis. That means what we need to reduce consumption in the north, but boost it in the south, and also within societies, of course. You know, in America, like the top 10% consume like 80% of the resources. You know, this is just completely irrational and unfair. So, on a world level, we need to work towards sort of middling convergence on some level of rational resource consumption that will enable us to have a sustainable society for future generations and make way for other species to live out their lives. Thirdly, we need to reprioritize and reorganize and restructure production to build products that we do need to be durable and rebuildable, recyclable, shareable as possible, and steer capital into things that society does need. Renewable energy, organic farming, and so on and so forth, public transportation. Fourthly, devise a rational means to approach waste and toxics to control and eliminate these as much as possible. Fifthly, lastly, to guarantee employment, because if you're going to have to shut down, this is a big problem, the environment versus economy issue. If you're going to shut down industries that need to be shut down, and this is just like the aviation industry. I mean, this is just crazy to be building more and more planes, flying people around the world for what purpose? If you're going to have to close these industries down or drastically retrench them, I'm not saying we should go back and live in like log cabins and ride horses, but you know, we have to get back to some reasonable level. And if you're going to do this, you have to provide jobs for people in those industries, because you can't expect people to fire them and just close the industry and lay them off. No, you have to guarantee people jobs at least equal pay that they have now. But there are many things, I listed a whole bunch, and many things in society that need to be done, from all kinds of public transportation, public water systems, environmental remediation, public health, schools, you know, all kinds of things need to be done. Work that needs to be done. It can't make a profit for a capitalist at the moment, but this is the kind of work that needs to be done. So there's lots of work for people to do, but we do need to get people out of polluting, non-productive industries that we don't need and get them into things that we do need to do. Okay? So that means you have to guarantee people jobs for that. What I'm saying is that you would have, in order to do that, of course, if you're going to close down Athabasca and Exit and TransCanada and whatnot, you have to nationalize them, at least here, I mean, or socialize them some way. You just have to take them over. I mean, mostly to close them down, cut them back, and to reprioritize, take the capital and labor out of those industries and send them other places. So I don't see any other way but to nationalize them. But I don't see any need to nationalize family farms and farmers markets and artisans and groceries and mom and pop restaurants and local businesses and workers co-ops and like. Small producers are not destroying the world, but large-scale corporations are destroying the world. And there's no way to green them. There's no way they're gonna, you can't fix them with tinkering with the market, with carbon taxes and whatnot. The only thing you can do is nationalize them. I know this seems like completely beyond the pale of legitimate discussion, but when it gets to be 110 degrees in New York, I mean, it'll become more of a legitimate discussion. I think that's kind of the way things are headed. But this is what we have to do. We have to nationalize large corporations, take them over, and reallocate their assets. Okay, so that's point 3. Point 4 is that planning can only work in the context for the common good if it's democratic. Planning has a kind of a bad rap in the United States because it's always associated with Stalinism, you know, and, that gives it a kind of a bad rap. But I don't see any real problem with economic planning. It's been done, it is done by capitalists a lot. I mean, you know, you have like big companies like, say, Boeing. It's got a budget of about $86 billion, and it has operations in 150 countries, and that puts it above the GDP of most countries in the world. And so they manage to plan all their operations in all their countries internally with a rational plan. I don't see any problem with that. Big corporations don't, so I don't see why they can't be taken over. Lots of big corporations are nationalized in Europe, and, you know, the nuclear power industry in France, and the public utilities most places, and some banks and transportation rails and whatnot, airlines, and most of these are publicly owned or largely publicly owned in Europe, so it didn't lead to Stalinism. Depends on the nation, depends on planning by whom, for whom. So what I'm arguing is that you need to have democratic decisions. So I don't see why society can't put the big questions up for a vote, like frack the planet or work our way off fossil fuels, drench the world's farms with toxic pesticides, or return to organic farming, public transportation or private cars as the mainstay. I don't see why we can't put these questions up for a vote. Shouldn't everyone have a say in decisions that affect them all? I mean, isn't that kind of the basic idea of democracy? The problem is in capitalism we have a vote, but what we vote on isn't very important, but it needs to be, because the economy is not what's up for vote, but it needs to be. Because in the last analysis, the only way to align social production with the needs of people is for people to organize it themselves, do it themselves. Again, you know, in Adam Smith's day, it didn't so much matter, at least for the environment, if businesses were run by private capitalists. I mean, they were nasty then and they're nasty now, but the decisions have limited impact on the planet. But today it matters, because today huge decisions that affect us all and thousands of other species, and even the fate of life on Earth, are still completely private decisions made by corporate boards on behalf of self-interested investors. You know, polls show that in America that 80% of Americans oppose GMO foods, but Americans don't get to vote on this. Well, why don't we get to vote on this? I mean, corporate boards vote to put GMOs and all kinds of toxic chemicals in our foods, and we're the ones who end up consuming it. So why don't we get to vote on these decisions? We don't have to be experts as everything to make such decisions. Corporate boards aren't composed of experts. They're mostly composed of big shareholders. They vote on what they want to do, and they hire experts to figure out how to implement their decision. Well, honestly, why can't we do that? I don't see why society can't do that. So we'd have to establish democratic institutions to plan and manage our social economy. We'd have to set up planning boards at local levels, regional, national, continental, and international levels. I mean, these have to include the whole communities, not just like workers, but consumers and farmers and peasants and technicians and managers. Everybody should have a vote. We have computers, we have the internet. Google's Larry Schmidt says that the whole world will be on the internet by 2020. So, you know, obviously many issues can be decided at local levels, and we should try to solve as many as possible at local levels. But others, like closing down the coal industry, like Hansen says, or repurposing the auto industry, or require larger scale planning. Some, like global warming or ocean acidification, deforestation, these require extensive international coordination, cooperation, essentially global planning. I mean, that's manageable. I don't see why that's a problem. I mean, the UN, we have the UN convention, which meets annually, as I said about at the beginning, you know, every year. You know, this year they're going to meet in Peru. And they're charged with regulating greenhouse gas emissions, but they don't have any enforcement powers. You know, they can't say to Americans, no, you cannot build these humongous gas hog Cadillacs and whatnot, SUVs. You have to find a way to get around without doing that. But they should have the power to do that. We should delegate them the power to do that, so that society makes some drastic changes. So direct democracy at the base, and delegated authority with the right of recall for higher level planning boards I think this can be worked out. The U.S. already has. In one of my papers, I wrote about the planning commissions for public utilities in America. They're amazingly transparent and democratic. It's one area of the American economy which is not, I mean, even though a lot of the utilities are owned by privately, many of them are publicly owned, but they're all regulated by these planning boards, which are astonishingly democratic. It's really quite interesting. A guy named Greg Palast wrote about this in a book on democracy and planning in America. It's really very interesting. He's a very good journalist. We have historical and current examples. Historically, of course, the Paris Commune, Russian Soviets, participatory planning in Brazil, La Via Campesina, and recovered factory movements in Argentina. California's initiative process is actually a pretty good democratic institution, a useful model, if it weren't corrupted by big money. I mean, if it was a fair vote, and so on. So we've had these kind of proto-socialist examples of planning, and I think this is manageable. And besides, the question really is, well, if the market can only destroy us, what else can we do? We have to find some other way to organize the economy. You know, we can't just go back to feudalism or slavery or something. So, you know, we have to find another way to organize the economy, and I just don't think there's any alternative but to directly plan it. Fifth, democracy can only work in the context of rough socioeconomic equality. When in the midst of the Great Depression, the great Supreme Court Justice Louis Brandeis said, we can either have democracy in this country or we can have great wealth concentrated in the hands of the few, but we can't have both. In saying that, he was more right than he knew. Today we have by far the greatest concentration of wealth in history, so it's hardly surprising that we have the weakest and most corrupt democracies since the Gilded Age. I don't think it's any better here in Canada than it is in the US. If we want democracy, we'd have to abolish the great wealth concentrated in the hands of the few. That means abolishing not just private property and the means of production, at least the large means of production, but also extremes of income, exorbitant salaries, great property and inheritance. Because the only way to prevent corruption of democracy is to make it impossible for people to materially gain by doing so, by creating a society with neither rich nor poor, a society of basic economic equality. In my view, there's an intrinsic connection between planning and democracy and equality. Does this mean we all have to dress in blue Mao suits and dine in communal mess halls? I don't think so. Lots of studies, Wilkinson and Pickett's Spirit Level, that's a book I recommend people look at, Spirit Level. The UK's New Economics Foundation. I've cited all these things in my papers. If you look at my papers, you can see them. At my papers, you can get them all free online, so if you ask me, I'll tell you how to do that. Have shown that people are happier, life is better, there's less crime and violence, fewer mental health problems in societies that are more equal, where income differences are small, where concentrated wealth is limited or non-existent. Even in capitalist society, you know, like in Scandinavia or a few other places. Gandhi was right in saying there's more than enough wealth for man's need, but never enough for men's greed. We don't have 5 planets to provide the resources for the whole world to live the kind of consumer style that Americans live, but at least the upper middle classes in America. But we have more than enough wealth to provide every human being on the planet with safe water and sanitation, quality food, quality housing, great public transportation, great schools and healthcare, all the authentic necessities we really need. And does this mean a sacrifice on austerity? I don't think so, on the contrary. I view an eco-socialist civilization as a liberation from the treadmill of alienated work, making useless, often destructive products, freeing ourselves from the toil of producing unnecessary or harmful commodities, that 3/4 of the production that's just a complete total waste, would free us all to dramatically shorten the necessary workday, to have more leisure time, to spend with our family and friends, to enjoy recreation, self-fulfillment, to build an alternative mode of life. And redefining the meaning of the standard of living to connote a way of life that's actually richer while consuming less. We as a society could start by instituting the human rights that were supposedly granted to us by the Declaration of Human Rights in 1948, signed by the US, but of course ignored ever since. And these economic rights are key. A right to rest and leisure, a right to a standard of living adequate for health and well-being of persons, motherhood and childhood entitled to special care and assistance, and these are kind of like basic human rights that people ought to have, and supposedly were granted to us more than half a century ago. Right to an education should be free, at least in elementary and fundamental stages, and education should be directed to the full development of human personality and so on, and development. And parents have a prior right to choose. These are basic rights that people should have and could have, and this would be the basis for a society of rough equality. That brings me to the last point, which is to say that, well, all I just said tonight, this is just crazy and utopian and impossible, and it'll never happen. And my answer is that, well, maybe, but what's the alternative? Because the planetary emergency we face is no joke. The specter of planet-wide ecological collapse and the collapse of civilization into some kind of Blade Runner dystopia is not so hypothetical as it once seemed. Just ask the Chinese. China's capitalist miracle has already driven that country off the cliff into headlong collapse, ecological collapse. China's rulers are faced with hundreds of mass protests around the country, many of them violent every day, hundreds of thousands a year. And it's all they can do is to keep the lid on. And as China itself demonstrates, it's hard when you live in this society. I think things never change, but China itself shows that economic systems come and go, and revolutions come and go, and capitalism's had a good 300-year run, but it's past its use-by date. The question is, will humanity stand by and let the world be destroyed to maintain the profit system? That's what would be truly crazy and utopian in my view. I just don't think the younger generation in this room and out there in the world is going to let that happen. And these kids here, did they stop the Enbridge Northern Pipeline? I mean, I think they went a long way to stopping it. And next week, you people here are going to get on this procession and help stop this pipeline to Vancouver, right? So I think it's really interesting that we live in the worst of times, and it just seems so awful. I mean, like Roger was saying at the beginning, he says we're just being assaulted left and right, and that's true. But I think we live in possibly the most critical moment in human history. Really, people, think about this. The conjuncture of global capitalist economic crisis and global ecological crisis are pushing the world, pushing people in the world, all over the world, to insurrection. From China, around the world, young and old are struggling against the destruction of nature, in India and everywhere, against pollution, against overdevelopment, against the siting of chemical plants and power plants, like especially in China, against predatory resource extraction like you here, against the imposition of GMOs, and against privatization of the remaining common lands and water and public services, against capitalist unemployment and precarity as they're struggling against in Europe, especially in many other places. These movements are still in their infancy and still unsure of their future against capitalism, not sure what that other possible world is going to look like, but their radical democratic instincts are, I believe, humanity's best hope. But this generation has to start by rejecting the capitalist argument that we have to destroy our futures to save our lives, because now we face the prospect of not just destroying communities, but the whole planet. I mean, it's shocking, it's actually true. But there are alternatives out there, and I'm going to mention a couple or three here. This is a study by an organization by the European Transport Workers Federation, and they put forward a program to reduce the use of automobiles in Europe and get people more into public transportation, to consolidate cities and reduce suburbia, move people back in more concentrated areas so public transportation works, to make things better, more efficient by reducing the speeds of things. You know, everybody thinks, oh, like high-speed trains. You know, China, they have high-speed trains all over the place. These high-speed trains consume enormous amounts of energy. It's just not necessary. It's not necessary to get everywhere so fast. You know, you just take a slow pace. You'll get there. It'll be okay. Electrify, to stop making electricity by burning coal. This is a union. This is a proposal list, and here, I think it's very quite insightful, is that if unions stick to policies that support growth in all sectors, we won't be able to get growth, won't be able to deliver that, because climate change is coming, and when climate catastrophe arrives, governments will cut aviation and trucking and much else swiftly and savagely, and then there'll be no protection for workers. So unions need to do two things at once. They need to campaign for serious cuts to emissions, but we need also to insist at the same time that those cuts can only come if workers are properly protected. We need to be in control of that process, not to have it done to us. So this is the European Transport Workers Association. I think they could do well to talk to some workers in some unions here in Canada who support fossil fuels. Why does Canada need to be transformed into the fossil fuel generating source of the world? And this is so crazy. I mean, you can have tourism, you can do a million things here. Well, why would you want to have this industry? It just destroys the country, the planet. These unions have to rethink their future here. A second thing, example of this is also really inspiring. A movement called Our Power. This is the Navajo Indians in Mesa, Arizona, and what they do, they have. This is on tribal land. They have coal mines there that they mine the coal, and then it's shipped in a slurry of water in pipes to on a few hundred miles or something to power plants, which then burn the coal. Well, it's doing two things. First of all, the coal and the mining and all that, but the coal is producing huge global warming. And then the water, they're extracting huge amounts of water in the ground, which they don't have a lot of water there in the southwest. It's drying up, and they're sending this in pipelines to slurry this coal along to the power plant. This is so crazy. So what they're proposing is to replace all of that with solar power, renewable energy. Still have power plants, but solar power, renewable energy plant that they themselves can build and operate and run. And this seems like a completely rational program to me. I don't know, why can't they do this? You know, this seems like a very smart thing to do. So that's the Our Power campaign. They have campaigns also in other cities. I've mentioned this. People should look it up. Did I give you the website? Well, you can just Google it. It'll come up. So that's one. And then just lastly, I'll just mention La Via Campesina, which is a huge movement of 250 million peasant farmers all over the world. In 70 countries and 150 national organizations. It's an autonomous, pluralist, decentralized, but organized and democratically organized international to resist corporate agribusiness, to defend small farmers, to defend food sovereignty, sustainable agriculture, social justice, and nature. They're not looking to keep peasants in some sort of museum quality small existence. They want to use modern technology, but they want to have it under their control and for what's rational and what's best for the environment and for food production and for their own lives and not for corporate profit. So I cite these examples of things that we might call kind of transitional struggles, transitional modes. And so we do have to, as our comrade from Rising Tide said, we have to mobilize, block the trains, the pipelines, commit civil disobedience. We need to go to jail like James Hansen and so many others. But it's not enough just to say no. We have to couple that, if we're going to win a big movement out of this, we have to couple those with plausible practical scenarios for alternate jobs for people. Because you can't just say no and people expect unemployment. We have to come up with alternatives for that, and we can do that. These are some examples. Most importantly, we have to as we wage these transitional struggles today, we have to explain to those that we work with why, at the end of the day, there is just no salvation under capitalism. To save the humans, we're going to have to completely overturn this existing social order, to build a completely different kind of economy from the bottom up, an economy by the people, for the people. Call it economic democracy or eco-socialism, whatever you want, but to turn Maggie Thatcher on her head, there is no alternative. We either save capitalism or we save the humans. We can't save both. There's no doubt that closing the book on capitalism and building an eco-social civilization is the greatest challenge humanity has ever faced. We may fail, but I don't think so. Thank you, and now I'd like to hear what you have to say.